I was looking to see if the scripture was printed on it. So now I have to let you know what the scripture is. It's Matthew 16. Matthew 16. Is better? Matthew 16, verse 13 through 16.
13 through 16?
Yes. See it loud. Someone have it? Good. Need to hold up? Wait.
Good.
Matthew 16, verses 13 through 16. And it's titled, Peter declares that Jesus is the Messiah. Starting on verse 13. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, is that what he said? Okay. Caesarea Philippi. He asked his disciples, who do the people say the Son of Man is? They replied, some say John the Baptist. Others say Elijah. And still others, Jeremiah or one of the other prophets. But what about you, he asked. Who do you say I am? Simon Peter answered, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. The word of God for the people of God. So, before I get into the sermon, I just want to thank you all, first of all, for allowing me to be here. Because, after I preached the last sermon, I expect, a good job, whatever. But I didn't expect to be doing this again, honestly. That was not my intention, the first sermon. So, honestly, I'm just, I'm very excited to be doing this again. I really appreciate the encouragement and support that you all have endlessly given me. And especially Pastor Okello, he's definitely been there for me as well. So, of course, I'm just very excited to get into the Word this morning and share with you this message. So, speaking of which, speaking of the Word and the message, the idea for this message actually came to me about a month ago when I started my classes at FSU. Now, first of all, are there any Seminoles in the building? No? Hey, we got one! The land of far, far away. Not clear. Huh?
Are we the only two?
I think we're the only two. Okay, we're right together. Anyways, as some of you may know, I recently began my graduate studies at Florida State University for my MSW, which is essentially my Master's in Social Work. So given that, FSU has such a great program, has a great reputation, and it's actually the first online program ever created for social work. I didn't know that. So I had some expectations, right? But, I expected it to be a little bit more difficult, some good questions, right? Some good essays. I was going to have to be writing, etc. But at the end of the day, I never expected to be stumped. I didn't expect the question to derail me or to force me to give up, right? And honestly, if I kept the same things in place like I used to at Valencia, at Seminole State, at UCF, FSU was going to be a breeze, right? So I was like, I'm not worried, right? And let me just tell you that that mindset completely changed very quickly, right? And it was not from the first month, it wasn't from the first week. The very first assignment, I looked at that assignment and I knew my life was never going to be the same. I was like, oh, this is something else, right? I remember I was sitting at Panera, and I just bought coffee, I just bought some food, whatever. I was sitting down, and within 5 minutes, I already started panicking. As I was looking at the question, I was like, you ever have those moments you don't even know where to begin to answer something? That was me in that moment. I was like, oh, wow, right? So I started thinking about UFC. I started thinking about football. I started thinking about back home. I started thinking about everything else but school. I'm like, I think I'm just going to go home, right? So I closed my laptop. As I'm putting everything away, as I'm walking out the building, right? Because I gave up that quickly. I remembered something kind of important. I remembered and I realized that I hadn't even read the textbook yet. I hadn't even opened the textbook, right? And as I was putting my backpack away in my car, I see the textbook, the DSM-5, still wrapped in the package. And I'm like, oh, wow. And it made me realize the idea for the sermon is, this is not Valencia. This is not UCF. This is not the same thing, right? And what I was realizing in that moment specifically was that this semester of school was not going to be the same as last semester at school. You see, I got used to being able to pass my classes without having to study. I was still studying, mind you, but it wasn't a requirement to get the A. And at this moment, I realized I'm really going to have to hit books if I expect to get an A. I'm really going to have to prepare, right? So in this season of life, what I was thinking as I was looking at this, not just in school, but in general, I was going to need to change the way I prepared if I hope to pass. And I need to learn some principles. You see, this morning, may I suggest to you that our faith, despite the humor in that story, it works very similarly. You see, whenever we're faced with difficult questions in our lives, it's not for the purpose of stumping us or derailing us, but rather so that we can learn new principles. Principles that prepare us to pass through new and difficult seasons in our lives. I mean, think about it. Every season of your life where your faith has grown, you have had to answer at least one difficult question. And every season that you were used by God, you were given at least one difficult choice to make. You had to make a difficult choice. You had to answer a hard question. And some of us may be living in that choice or in that questioning right now. You see, no matter what season of life you're in, you are undoubtedly having to ask yourself difficult questions throughout and making difficult choices about where you want to be and about who you want to be. We see Jesus in this passage asking his disciples a series of questions, not just for the purpose of preparation, but for the purpose of principle. To provide you with some context real quick before I get into it. During the time of Matthew 16, Jesus only had 3 to 6 months left to live. Well, I shouldn't say live. Left to walk this earth, right? Because he's still alive, isn't it? Correct? To walk this earth, right? He knew that his purpose was coming to pass. Thus, he knew that his time here was going to come and pass. The story is built on the fact that Jesus, who is the one asking the questions this time, is doing so to prepare his disciples spiritually for a life without him physically here on this earth. And I find this ironic because we're in the same place. It can be difficult for us to live spiritual lives here on an earth that Jesus doesn't seem to be physically on. Essentially, it is difficult to live faithfully when Jesus doesn't feel close. So I guess the question that this passage provides an answer to, or the question I want to ask you this morning, is how do you prepare for that? How can we prepare to follow Jesus in a world filled with so many distractions, and that in a world that he doesn't seem to be physically on? So, to help us answer these questions, I want to share with you this passage in Matthew 16, where Jesus prepares his disciples not only for a difficult season, but for some difficult choices that they're going to have to make. So, starting at verse 15, if you want to follow along with me. When Jesus came to the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, "Who do the people say the Son of Man is?" They replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah, and still others Jeremiah or one of the other prophets," right? So I want to point out the significance of these two verses, because it's not as much as the question as it is in the response of the disciples. You see, the disciples, they didn't just provide these names just to give names. You know, these names, they have a reason. There's a reason why the disciples said John the Baptist, Elijah, Jeremiah. Each one of these prophets had qualities of Jesus. They had characteristics of Jesus, but none could actually answer the question of who Jesus truly was. I'm going to explain that. So starting with John the Baptist. He was a man of charisma, a man with appeal. People were drawn to him. They were close with him. In Mark chapter 2, it goes as far as to say that all the land of Judea, not some, not many, all the land of Judea, and those from Jerusalem went out to him and were all baptized by him in the Jordan River, confessing of their sins. So again, all the land of Judea went out to him. Not some, not many, all of them. Given that Jesus himself drew large crowds of people, the disciples found it comparable to compare him to John because of what they knew of John. But John's charisma was not enough to be Jesus. Elijah, on the other hand, was a man of calling. And I know all the prophets here had callings. However, Elijah's calling is a bit different. It's a bit special. Despite performing many miracles and even reinventing the school of prophets after Samuel, raising Elisha, which saved the Jewish faith in a lot of ways, Elijah's calling was more than simply mission. It was ingrained in his character. You see, Elijah was believed to be the prophet that preceded the Messiah's coming. So during Passover, if you ever have been in a Jewish household, you know, many, even today, they'll set up like a cup and they'll save a seat at their table. And what they do, they'll open the front door of their house, expecting Elijah to walk through. Sorry. Expecting Elijah to walk through, right? And it's for that reason that, in that sense, that Jesus, the Messiah, had such a calling. You know, it's confirmed this since Malachi 4:5 when it reads, "Behold, I will send you Elijah, the prophet, before the coming of the great and dreadful day of the Lord." Given that Jesus himself was a man of such calling and such leadership, the disciples compared him in the same way, but again, because of only what they knew of Elijah. Elijah's calling was not enough to be Jesus. Lastly, the name Jeremiah is mentioned. So, John, Elijah, Jeremiah. Otherwise known as the wailing prophet. Jeremiah was a man of compassion. Now, his compassion stemmed from the fact that and while he had such a compassionate heart for the Israelites, for his people, he did not bring forth a very comforting message. Unsurprisingly, Jeremiah was rejected by many of the religious leaders of his time. And similarly, Jesus' compassion was rejected by many of the religious leaders of his time. So similar to Jeremiah, Jesus' compassion created controversy. And so the disciples again compared him in the same way because of what they knew of Jeremiah. But again, Jeremiah's compassion was not enough to be Jesus. So what am I bringing these points for? As you can see, within all these names, Jesus is being compared to people of charisma, people of calling, and people of compassion. Charisma, calling, compassion. And despite the fact that these are moral characteristics, Jesus is above the character of man. He is more than a charismatic preacher. He is more than just a called prophet. He is more than a compassionate human being. He is Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, the Son of the living God. And it goes to show that despite understanding God's charisma, despite receiving a calling from God, despite witnessing God's compassion in your very lives, having commonality with Christ is worth more than having the characteristics of Christ. And what do I mean by that? Commonality, what does that mean? There's a verse in 1 John that states, "And so we shall have fellowship in Christ." The word fellowship in the Greek refers to a living, breathing, familial relationship with God. So it goes deeper than just simply a relationship. It's a living, breathing, familial one. However, looking a bit deeper at the word fellowship in that verse, the root word for fellowship means common. To be in common with, to have commonality with something or someone. So to illustrate this, just for a second, think of all the relationships that you have right now in your life. Good or bad, just you have friends, you have family members, you have pastors, you have church members, co-workers, bosses, who you may not like, but they're there. When you come to think about it, you have a lot of relationships. However, just because you have a living, breathing, maybe a familial relationship with these people, does not mean that you want to be just like them. You can share the characteristics, but you don't have to make the same choices. You understand? There's a difference. And Jesus is highlighting an important point here. There's a difference between having the characteristics of God and actually being in commonality with God. So I ask you this. What can we do to not only know more about Jesus, the person, but rather what can we do to have more in common with Jesus? Seek commonality, not just the character. Which takes us to the next question. Verse 15. Jesus asked his disciples in verse 15, "But what about you? Who do you say I am?" Simon Peter answered, "You are the Messiah, the Son of the living God." What surprised me most about this verse is not only the fact that Peter got it right, because usually he's very impulsive, very direct, right? So it's not only that, but it's the fact that there were 11 other disciples on the boat who happened to be mute in that moment, who said nothing. No one spoke. Only one of them spoke. And it makes me wonder, because they got this question right before, right? In Matthew 14, verse 33, after Jesus had just finished feeding, 5,000 people, loaves of bread, etc., and he started walking on water to them, they exclaimed to themselves, "Truly, you are the Son of God." So, you see, this wasn't supposed to be a trick question. This was not meant to stop, to derail them. They knew the answer already. Jesus wasn't trying to make them look foolish, trying to, teach us. He was trying to remind them of a principle. And in order to understand this principle, honestly, okay, we're gonna do something different since we're looking at the context, right? We're gonna pretend and imagine that we're on the boat with Jesus, right, having this conversation. So we'll take this real quick. Don't mind the static. All right. All right. So we're on a boat, right? See the waves, right? Imagine with me. Put on your creative caps. So. No, it's just overboard. So let's imagine this for a second, right? So we're sailing to Caesarea Philippi, right? We're sailing, and Jesus just finished asking you, who do other people say I am? Now he's in the midst of asking you, who do you say I am, right? And for some reason, you're not answering the question. Peter's the only one that's actually answering the question, right? So to give you some context of the city, what's the surroundings, right? Caesarea Philippi is a Roman city, right, with the name Julius Caesar, is now a Roman city. However, it was not always known as a Roman city. It was also called Peneus, Peneus, home of the goddess Pan, right? So in this, we have two conflicting, we have the Roman temples on this side, we have the Greek temples of Pan on this side, right? And this town has been a central hub of commerce for quite some time. And not only for commerce, but for worship. People come here for worship, right? So I want you to just imagine this as we're in the boat, right? So I'm talking to you, and you look at me this way. So over here, we have one of the largest statues of Julius Caesar at the time, right? On my left. It's literally carved out of stone into the hillside, and underneath it, we have a temple at the bottom, a Roman temple, okay? Did it cover out? Okay, yeah. So at the Roman temple, on my left. On my right, we have 14 temples of Pan, all across the hillside. And all the people, given that it's such a prominent god at the time, are worshiping along this edge. And within this edge, there are caves where people are worshiping as well, right? So we have the temples and the caves on my left, okay? On my right. And then within this temple, because people, again, worship gods together at the same time. That was a thing, it was common at the time. So within the temples of Pan, you have a massive temple of a prominent god who you might have heard of, the temple of Baal, right? The Canaanites. So just imagine, you can't miss it, right? You can't miss Julius Caesar's face just coming out here. You can't miss all the temples coming here. And you can't miss, essentially, Baal's temple at this moment as well. You can't miss these things, right? And now Jesus is saying, look at me. Who do you say I am? And they can't get the question, right? So it's not simply, due to the fact that, again, Jesus is talking to the disciples about who he is as a God. But the disciples are literally pulling into an environment that is challenging his divinity. So you have competing ideologies, you have competing beliefs, you have competing choices on the background. You can't just pass these by. You can't miss these, right? And with that in mind, Jesus again asked, look at me, who do you say I am? Because remember, again, it's not like they knew the answer to this question, but for some reason they couldn't get it. And in my opinion, chapter 14, all 12 of them spoke. Chapter 16, only one of them spoke. The question was easier, essentially, when they were surrounded in a different environment, when they were alone with Jesus, when he was performing the miracle. And when their circumstances began to change, the question became more difficult. The answer got a bit more cloudy. So essentially, when we focus on the present background, we forget about the past blessings. The disciples saw what was around them rather than who was on the boat with them. So the question wasn't answered not because it came with difficulty. It wasn't answered because it came with a distraction. So I guess the question I want to ask you this morning is, essentially, how do distractions shape your choices? How do distractions shape who you want to be as a Christian? All around. You can't miss them. So now we're at the final question. I'm going to put this back. I'm going to preach properly this time. Give me a second. I was saying about just sitting there the whole time, but I was like, no, I can't do that. So that takes us to the final question. So now, as you're looking through verses 13 through 16, you may be wondering where that is, because Jesus only asked 2 questions in the passage. But trust me, there is another question, and it merits a very, very important response. The question is, Tetina me legete inai. Tetina me legete inai. That's Greek. You want to say it with me? Tetina me legete inai. Tetina me legete inai. That is a literal translation of but who do you say I am? The literal translation in the Greek of what Jesus is saying. And while the English translation is almost verbatim, it makes sense. It's almost verbatim. It's a little off. There's a difference in one word that Jesus uses that I think is a very important question on its own. And the literal meaning, again, of this, what it says is, but whom do you pronounce me to be? So, who do you say I am versus who do you pronounce me to be? So I want to focus on the meaning of inai, the meaning of be. Because there are 2 different meanings of be in the Greek text. It's 2 different ones. I think there's a reason why Jesus worded it this way. So the first inai is philosophical. It's what we will commonly use as be, right? It means to simply exist. So I will be with you means I will exist with you. You know? So I will be with you, I exist, right? However, inai also has a different meaning, a more personal meaning. So there's a philosophical and there's a personal one. The personal one, it means not just to simply exist, but it also means everything dear in one's life. So everything, in the sense, I exist with you, becomes I am everything with you. So see that meaning. With that being said, the question changes a bit. Jesus isn't asking to simply be a part of your belief system or a part of your philosophy or just to simply exist. He is asking if a relationship with him is worth everything to be a part of. Philosophically speaking, God exists. Personally speaking, is God your everything? Your meaning of be changes everything. So this morning, what I want to ask you is not only who do other people say Jesus is, or even who do you say Jesus is, but rather when you look at your life, who do you want Jesus to be? So I'll tell you a story about a kid who I knew, used to know, back in the day. That kind of explains this well. And sort of what impressed me the most about this kid was the fact that despite not having a relationship with God or Jesus whatsoever, his knowledge of God was immense. This kid was on there. Like by the 4th grade, he could memorize the 10 Commandments. He memorized the Apostles' Creed. He memorized, the Lord's Prayer. And he even memorized, he was able to recite the entire Bible in order by 4th grade. And I remember him reciting all these books in front of his congregation. And by middle school, he had already read through the entire Bible. High school, he had read through the entire Bible twice. And despite this knowledge that he held about God as a name at such a young age, it took him a while, it took until he was much older to recognize who God actually was personally. And one day, there was a preacher who took the time to mentor this kid, helped him get out of trouble, per se. And it was this personal relationship with the preacher that led the young man into a personal affirmation with God. He realized there was more to Christianity than just simply going to church on Sunday or reading your Bible, praying. At the end of the day, it's about following Christ, being forgiven by Christ, and being able to declare that, yes, Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, like Peter. January 3rd, 2019, I was that kid in Pastor O'Keller's office. Yeah, I still remember that day. So the question I want to ask you today is not only who do you want Jesus to be, but are you willing to be like Jesus for someone else? When you look in the mirror, who do you want to be? And that's the question. Bow your heads with me, please. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for your Son, Jesus, for preparing the disciples, and in turn for preparing us. Lord, help us to trust in you, despite what others may compare you to, and despite what our circumstances may lead us into. I thank you for not simply existing, but for being everything. Help us to remember this as we try to be more like you each and every day. Thank you, Jesus. In your name I pray.